in the middle of, I mean, it's December. It's like 2 weeks before Christmas. And we've been uploading videos in a playlist on this 2005 Chevy Avalanche that we completely refurbed for the little big dummy Crazy Steve-O. And the truck has been, knock wood, great for him. Had a lot of ups and downs during that, but I'm slowly getting all the videos up, and we're a couple months behind in real time on the videos in the playlist. And we got to the point where I said, oh wait, we're at the time frame where we were fixing his extended crank problem. So just to catch you up, he had an issue that was an extended crank time. So he would get in the car, he'd crank it away, and it wouldn't start. He'd stop, reprime it again, and it would start right up. And that would happen probably 85 to 90% of the time. Sometimes, you know, that 10 to 15%, he'd get in, turn the key, things start right up. But he always had that extended crank time. So we chased down, we looked at his fuel pressure, we looked to see if his fuel pressure was bleeding off, we looked to see, and we did videos on it, we looked to see if he had an injector or injectors that were leaking, so we did a leak down test on all the injectors, we made a video on that. They're all in the playlist link below. And we were trying to troubleshoot it, and we said, well, the vehicle, not everything in the vehicle, but the vehicle's got 244,000 miles on it, or 240, whatever it was, 239 when we bought it. We said, let's, you know, we've replaced everything. And, you know, the engine's been out, we got new heads on it, everything's been regasketed, a new cam, and we said, let's just do the fuel pump for peace of mind, and that should hopefully fix the problem, because the thought was, fuel pump, check valve in the fuel pump, there's no regulator on the rail in this vehicle, everything is in the fuel pump. The fuel filter, the regulator, the check valve that holds pressure in the system, everything's in the fuel pump assembly. So we dropped the tank, put a fuel pump assembly in it, a good one, not a cheapo Chinese Fujigawa one. And even my local mechanic, who I was asking about it, and he looked at the symptoms and he goes, oh, definitely fuel pump. We throw the fuel pump in, no change. So I go back to my local mechanic and I tell him what we did, and he goes, you got a bad fuel pump. He said, we've had bad fuel pumps lately, you know, AC Delco pumps, Delphi pumps. He goes, we've had a lot of bad ones, a lot of comebacks. And I said, okay, but I wasn't 100%. He goes, we'd put a fuel pump in it. If you brought it here, we'd put another fuel pump in it. So we did some more testing and checking and testing and checking, and we couldn't get anywhere. So we said, let's try another. We even went to a separate mechanic, a real shop. They looked at it, I gave them the whole history and story, and they said fuel pump. Yep, even though you got a new one in there, fuel pump. So we dropped the tank again, put a fuel pump in it again. Same thing, no change. So I start just scouring the Google webs and try to find somebody who's got a similar symptom, and everything was pointing towards fuel pump, not maintaining fuel pressure, and that's why you got to crank it and build pressure, and then it starts right up. But my whole thing was, how come every once in a while you got in it, turn the key, and boom? And it didn't make a difference how long it sat. So a lot of people say, well, did it sit overnight? Did it sit for a couple days? It didn't matter. It could sit for 5 minutes or 5 hours or 50 hours. That didn't change that 85 to 90% of it, the time you have to do it twice. And he drove it for a period of a few months. And the more we drove it, the more we realized it wasn't how long it sat. It wasn't whether he primed it or not that he can get it to go. It was the second ignition cycle. It would always start on the second ignition cycle. Now, sometimes it would start the first try, that 10% to 15% tops, it would go first try. But for the most part, he needed to turn that key off and go to start it again right away. So if he just went and cranked it and left it, and then turned the key off and walked away for an hour and came back to it, he would still have to crank it, turn it back off, crank it again, starts right up. So it was the second successive ignition cycle, right after the first one. It wasn't if you waited a long time, and that narrowed my focus down. I said, okay, these vehicles are computer controlled for things that in the old cars, you know, like old basic, you know, Chevelles and stuff from the 70s and 80s were mechanical. So it's, where is the timing? And then I'm thinking the crank correlation, the cam crank correlation. So we tried to relearn that cam crank correlation. That's a relearn that you have to do when you replace a crank sensor. So I said, well, maybe that correlation is off, and we were getting on the right track. So I go to redo it, and I could not get my tool, my scan tool, my bidirectional scan tool has that feature, and we couldn't get it to relearn the cam crank correlation. So I said, well, maybe we got a problem with the crank sensor, because that was the only sensor on the engine that we didn't change when we had the engine out. For some reason, I didn't order one. If I would have ordered one, we would have changed it, but that was the only one I didn't change. So I'm like, maybe I got a bad crank sensor. So I buy a good crank sensor, I bring it over to my local mechanic, and I said, can you throw this crank sensor in and do the cam crank relearn, the correlation relearn? And they did it, and they did the relearn, nothing. Still the same problem. So I said to the mechanic, I go, what do you think? And he, fuel pump. I go, third fuel pump, really? He goes, yep, fuel pump. So I'm like, it can't be a fuel pump. I am not going with fuel pump. We did the cam crank correlation, and it's always the second ignition cycle. So I start searching, and it's very difficult when you have a specific problem like that to focus on your search. That second, it's like, you know, extended crank, and then you get all the people with fuel problems, mostly on the extended crank. It took me a long time. Steven continued to drive it, and I'm going through all the receipts of what we did. We put a new cam sensor in. Now we got a new crank sensor in. We used brand name quality stuff. Could we have a bad one somewhere? Yeah. We really need Eric O. And I know that he doesn't take YouTube people, you know, like he doesn't want YouTube customers going up. I would have drove upstate. It was driving me freaking bananas. And I stumble across a thread on one of the forums, one of the GM truck forums, about cam sensors. And the people, a guy posts something, he's describing the exact symptoms we have, second ignition cycle only. It'll only start on the second ignition cycle, and he's had it for years, and he just dealt with it because nobody could figure it out. And he had the same issues, the same symptoms, and he went to mechanics wherever he lived in whatever part of the world he lived, and they all said fuel, 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 and he had been down the road I was down. He replaced the fuel sensor, he did the cam crank relearn, he did a crank sensor, he did a cam sensor, he did all kinds of stuff, and somebody chimes in and goes, oh, it's your cam sensor. So he puts in another cam sensor, and he goes, no, it's not the cam sensor. No change. And the guy's going, no, it's your cam sensor. They're all bad. And to make a long story short, what it was is they're all bad. For some reason, GM redesigned the cam sensor. And they redesigned the cam sensor, so the aftermarket then redesigns the cam sensor. So whether you buy a GM, whether you buy a Delphi, whether you buy an aftermarket brand, they're all for this redesign that apparently the redesign only works on later, meaning newer vehicles. So these early vehicles, they changed it for those vehicles, and it was supposed to work for these vehicles, but it doesn't. So every new cam sensor that people throw in screws up the vehicle. And what's happening is, from my understanding from the research I did, was the computer is not seeing a good cam signal. So when you go to start it, it's not seeing the cam signal, so it just cranks. And then when you do it a second time, it defaults to a like safe mode setting, and it starts up. But it's not seeing a good cam signal, and it's not throwing a code for some reason. So it's seeing something, but it's not something that's going to make it throw the code. So whatever the parameters are to throw a code and set a check engine light is not happening. The fix that a lot of these guys were saying is to go to a junkyard and get one, and get an old GM one. And they even gave the number. And so I go on eBay, and I find it on eBay. And there's junkyards, you know, parting out Ellis Motors all over the place, all over the country. And people are selling them. And I ordered 2 of them. And I also ordered a new O-ring for each one. The O-rings were just as much as the sensor. I forget what I paid for the sensor itself. But this is one of the old ones that I was able to get on eBay. So it's a 12561211. 12561211. And that's the exact part number that they said in the forums. They said, get one out of a junkyard with that part number on it, and that is the old design cam sensor, and your problem will be solved. So I ordered 2 of them on eBay. I ordered a fresh set of O-rings, 1 for each of them. So I have this one left over with a new O-ring in the bag, and the original one that I bought on eBay, because we do have a fleet of these GMT 800 vehicles, and if the cam sensor that's in one of them goes bad, getting a new cam sensor is not going to solve our problem. It's just going to exacerbate our problem. I'm actually going to order a couple more of these so that I have them. We put the cam sensor in. You can do it without taking the intake off in these vehicles. So you got to do it blind. It's back there in the back of the intake, you know, on the top of the engine, behind the intake, next to the oil pressure sender. So you got to snake your arm in there. It's a 10 millimeter, small 10 millimeter bolt that's holding it in. It slides out. You slide the new one in, put a new O-ring, lube the O-ring up good, slide it in, cinch it down with the 10 millimeter bolt, plug your electrical connection back in, and it starts first ignition cycle every single time by putting an old GM cam sensor in. So there's a problem with these cam sensors. Will the GM and the aftermarket change and make cam sensors for these older vehicles? Who the hell knows? In the meantime, get you one if you have one, because you might need one in the future, and you're going to be screwed if you got to put a new one in because they don't work for whatever reason. I don't know whether it's the length. No one on the forums can come up with a reason other than this is your fix. So that's where we were at with this vehicle. Put the cam sensor in. We didn't film it because we were frustrated and just wanted to get it in because we couldn't believe that this was going to work after all that time. We threw it in and it worked, and now we can continue with the rest of our videos now that this one's up. So it's sort of the timeline is right on our video. So if you ran into this problem, or you had this problem, or you have this problem and you're trying to figure it out, put it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your fix, your solution, maybe your thoughts on why the new ones don't work. Let me know. Hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.